with Professor Konstantinos Grivas. We admire his speech, the moderation and precision with which he positions himself, as well as his scientific background, and we are particularly happy that such a man is still allowed to teach our military personnel. He will talk to us about the cultural roots of wokeism, but will also raise something that we have not done so far, and it's the neoconservatives. Good evening. Allow me to wish you a good evening and to thank Konstantinos for his kind words. However, today I ask for your understanding and your forgiveness in advance, because I want to deal with some issues that are beyond the narrow field of my expertise. I'm going to try to get into some very deep waters. So, objectively, I may make scientific mistakes. However, I believe that it is an issue that we need to discuss in depth. My view is, then, that the so-called woke culture is a mixture of hatred, a perception of omnipotence, denial of identity, and the demonization of some dark other, some enemy either internal or external, or both. And the basis of this culture, the core, the enological, the ontological core, is what Dostoevsky calls in his amazing work The Demonized, the world idol of the anthropogod, that is, a self-reading of Western man who deifies himself, without however managing to liberate him. From some other pathologies of Western culture, such as guilt and the demonization of the other. Well, I will insist on this. Christianity is the cultural foundation of Western civilization. And let no one say, because we discuss it with colleagues and in university classrooms, that we are not interested in these things. Stuff like, I am not, I don't believe, I am an atheist or I am irreligious or anything else. We are interested in the influence of Christianity and in this case Western Christianity, which is something completely different from true Christianity as expressed in Orthodoxy as a cultural dimension. Created a series of worldviews that have dramatically influenced and continue to influence the way we perceive the world and take action and make decisions in the Western world. For example, my subject, and that's where I started my study many years ago. The perception of the decisive battle has rather clearly come from an eschatological reading of what is happening at the geopolitical level. There is no concept of decisive battle in the art of war of the Chinese, Indians, or even the Japanese. It's something else. So, Christianity was something very, very good for man, and specifically for Western man. And I repeat, exclusively to its cultural impact. He offered a series of worldviews, such as the perception of teleological, ascending, evolutionary, linear time, without which the concept of progress and evolution that characterizes Western civilization would not even exist. The perception of the divine creation of the world freed man from the tyranny of nature, from paganism at all levels that characterized even the culture of the ancient Greeks. The ancient tragedy, let's say, is precisely this. You cannot escape from impersonal forces that oppress you. The concept of the divine creation of the world by an uncreated God, an intellect with which you communicate, which created you, has given you a primary role, and through the doctrine of the Incarnation and the Trinity, man himself, by grace of course, not by nature, becomes God himself, is the terrifyingly powerful cultural foundation upon which the self-aggression of Western man was built and managed to create what we call today Western civilization. So in complete contradiction to what is commonly said, namely that religion in general and Christianity in particular has been a barrier to progress, science, technology, and all related things. If there were no worldviews created by Christianity, there would be no science or technology. I repeat, this concept of evolution and progress that characterizes us and only us and not other civilizations on the planet that operate based on a perception of cyclical and repetitive time. All of this is very nice and very good. But in the West, at some point things went wrong. Specifically, when Western Christianity began to separate from true Christianity, that is, Eastern Christianity of Orthodoxy, the fathers of Western Christianity, and more specifically Thomas Aquinas and especially St. Augustine, began to place great emphasis on certain things. In the will of man and in the ability of the human mind to understand the mystery of God. Thus, the concept of intellectualism was created and, as Father Nikolaos Ludovicos says, an atypical worship of power and will was created within the core of Western Christianity. Additionally, through St. Augustine, who was a Manichaean until his mature age, Manichaean elements were also passed on, even though he himself had rejected them, but his culture was that of Gnosticism and elements of it. In other words, elements of the division of man into body and spirit, into body and soul, have passed, while in canonical Christianity it is a psychosomatic unity. There was the perception of the superiority of spirit over matter, the demonization of matter, and above all, a very strong element of guilt passed into Western Christianity, I repeat, which is described very, very well for anyone who wants something more, by Pascal Bruckner in the Society of Remorse. The most important thing, however, which directly concerns us, is that a self-worship of the human mind and the possibilities of its intellect, applied logic, and science has been created within the Western world. Subsequently, in a historical process that we do not need to discuss how and why, through the Enlightenment and humanism, this auto-worship was disconnected from its theological element. The Western world proceeded to the death of God and essentially deified itself. He therefore believed that through his intellect and through science he could completely control the world, what was happening in it, and bring about the achievement within this material world, not in the beyond, not in the end, of perfection in all points, in all areas, and at some point achieve the end of the history, the nihilist paradise. This utterly arrogant notion of human omnipotence reaches its peak with Marxism. Marx is the one whom both Engels and their descendants believe to have identified, defined, recorded, and designed the mechanism by which history will at some point be lead to perfection, to the earthly paradise. And now man needs nothing else. Essentially, the God man is looking for, Marx writes characteristically, is himself. When Marxism becomes applied with the October Revolution and we now move to Marxism-Leninism, then this perception becomes magnified. Because it's no longer something we talk about happening at some point in history. It's something that's happening now. It has been achieved by Bolsheviks at the expense of all opposition. And we are literally one step away from reaching the end of history and achieving heaven on earth as we understand it. Then, too, this perception of the omnipotence of man, this anthropotheism, reaches its utmost limits. Characteristically, Professor John Gray of Oxford University says, in one of his books, The Straw Dogs, in the early Soviet Union, the movement of cosmists is born who believe that they can now not only achieve a classless society or anything else through science, but also defeat death. We can travel through space to places and times that science has not yet dreamed of. But above all, this is to defeat death and achieve the absolute deification of man. Of course, reality did not justify these expectations. Of course, we didn't have anything like that. On the contrary, the Soviet Revolution, the October Revolution, degenerated in an extremely oppressive regime. Then with World War II, Stalin, either for reasons of expediency, or because he believed it, or because a mixture of the two, remarried existing socialism with national identity and allowed, to some extent, orthodoxy to be integrated into it. There is the classic story that he sees Saint Matrona in Moscow in his dream, when the Germans are outside Moscow and he goes and finds her in an apartment and so on and so forth. Well, but in any case, this perception of the omnipotence of man that Marxist-Leninism had imposed on Russia and the Soviet Union is being lost. But where does it survive? It survives in Western communism and mainly in the Trotskyist people mentioned before who hate both Stalin and Russia. So these people take this raw perception of the omnipotence of the human spirit and impose it within their own personal reading. But if these things happen with regard to Marxism, Leninism, Trotskyism, and in the West we have a series of contagions. That is, the absolute self-admiration of Western man that existed until the end of the 19th century, after the Holocaust of the two world wars, the nuclear war, the fear of nuclear annihilation, and a series of others begins to collapse and slowly begins to turn into fear and self-loathing. The anthropogod begins to fear himself and loathe himself. So here, this inherent element of guilt that exists, I repeat, in the hard core of the Western world, comes to the surface again and comes to the surface very strongly. So the people of the West are beginning to be dominated by networks of guilt, and at the same time it is precisely because the cultural paradigm in the epistemological sense of the term that Christianity has brought, the post-pagan paradigm, so to speak, is beginning to collapse, precisely because this entire civilization is going through a crisis and a kind of guilt-centered paganism is returning. Who is this? We are still living it today. It is the perception that nature will punish us. We sin against nature. The concept of climatic change is clearly a religious concept that has these things at its core. It is the perception of ancient people before Christianity that there is a natural order that we cannot disrupt, and if we disrupt it we will be punished, we will suffer nemesis. So, all of this is affecting today's world a lot. And another element that I also failed to mention, which also characterizes Western Christianity, especially after the second wave of Western intellectualism through Protestantism, which is individualism. Western man from a certain point onward denies collective identities. So the combination of all of what I said very, very broadly, and a series of other factors creates, to paraphrase Sartre, a hole in the human entity. Today's Western man denies his own existence. He denies self-definition through any collective identities. At the same time, the implications of the anthropogod, the concept of omnipotence, remain. This, in my opinion, is the core of all these paranoid notions about choosing genders. It seems like a very powerful and voluntaristic reading of the world that denies reality and says very simply that I will choose through my will what kind of gender I am. If I want, I can choose my gender. If I don't want to, I don't choose. And it looks dangerously similar to the same concepts that the Nazis, the German Nazis, had. If you watch Riefenstahl's iconic propaganda film, it is the triumph of the will. That is, I, Hitler and mine, through our will alone, will conquer the world. This is of course an extroverted paranoid willpower. The current willful paranoia of the rightists is healthy. It's a kind of implosion. By my own will, I am not interested in controlling the external world, but I will control the internal one. But especially when there is this toxic mixture of individualism, perceived omnipotence, and guilt and denial of identity, in order for a person to be able to have an elementary self-reading of themselves, it is required, as Lacan says, to have a dark other. That is, to demonize something either outside of our society or internally, so that we recognize ourselves as the opposite of that demonized thing. Which I repeat, the West has characterized as a characteristic of demonizing internal and external opponents. So an extremely toxic mixture is created, which I am now entering into my own expertise. In my opinion, it is very dangerous. It enormously influences the geopolitical behavior of the West. It even influences the informal but decisive nuclear war, the perceptions of nuclear war. Well, it's something very dangerous. It can lead us beyond all that we are criticizing here and into very dangerous situations in the future. But we don't talk about all this, and I'll end with this. I think I became very tiring. We are not saying this to demonize the Western world. No. We belong to this world. But how do we belong? We belong as its powerful leaders, fathers, and healers. We said that in my opinion and the opinion of those much more important than me, all of this stems from failures and corruptions that existed at the core of Western civilization, which is Christianity. I repeat, as a cultural dimension. Let's not get into the other one. He is here. It is Greece. It is orthodoxy. The real Christianity. So if Greece wants to accept itself, to accept its role as a cultural superpower, to accept its Christian past, I repeat, as no other cultural magnitude, and decides to function exactly as I said as a cultural superpower in a world dominated by very dangerous paranoid interpretations, because it is not only the denial of genders, it is not only the denial of collective identities, it is not only the denial of the nation, it is not only the denial of history and hatred for our ancestors, it is also hatred towards enemies, the opponents of the West. It's one thing to face Russia and China as an adversary rationally and see how you can confront them, and it's another thing entirely to face them as demons on earth and wage an all-out war against them with whatever that means given the nuclear power that exists on both sides. So, precisely so that we don't go into a war of civilizations and so that we can go into a conversation of civilizations and so that Western civilization can return to its factory settings, so to speak, and eliminate these pathogens, this can only be done through Greece and Orthodoxy. But in order for Greece to do this, in order to be able to function in this context, it must accept its role, it must accept itself, it must break away from perceptions of introversions, perceptions that we are an inferior nation, that we are backward and all the related ones, that we must become Europeans and understand at some point that it is precisely we who hold the key to the salvation of Western civilization in the future. This was everything you had to hear from me. Thank you very much for listening.